Okay, well, it looks like we're at time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, so hi, everyone. My name is Emilia Marcyk Taylor, and I'm the head of reference and discovery services at Michigan State University. And I'm going to be presenting about a case study that I did with some students that I supervise and I'm titling this Resurfacing Debunked Scientific Racism, an AI Case Study. So let me just get this going. Okay, I've started the presentation, or I've started the, the recording. Okay, thank you to our partners. Okay, so here we are. So this is this was inspired by an article that I read in Wired. It was written by David Gilbert and came out in October of last year. And the headline was very attention grabbing. So it was Google, Microsoft, and Perplexity are promoting scientific racism in search results. And I'll put the link in the chat in case anyone wants to take a look at that. But it was a really interesting article, and it happened that I was right in the middle of working with a group of 8 students that I supervise as part of our peer research advisor program in the library around a whole kind of training sequence around AI. So I thought that this was a kind of a perfect case study to introduce to them to demonstrate some of the issues that they might encounter with AI, especially if they're using AI tools to find information or like data or kind of what students often call facts for a research paper. So I definitely highly recommend that if you haven't seen it. Just a brief outline of kind of what the issue is if you haven't read the article. So the basic premise is that IQ scores are often used by racist movements to justify the superiority of the white race. That's pretty clear. It's been demonstrated over and over. But what the journalist found is that when searching for IQ by nation, so if you kind of ask like what particular country's IQ score is, the AI summary in a lot of these tools, so Google, Perplexity, ChatGPT, right, will give you a specific numerical answer. And then the question that the journalist was asking is, where do these numbers actually come from? Like, where is it getting this data from? And what they found is that it's mostly from a data set which was published by Richard Lynn. He was the president of the Pioneer Fund, which promoted eugenics, and generally was a promoter of eugenicist ideas. A little bit more about Richard Lynn. Why are his statistics concerning? Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that he cherry-picked his research results. For example, he ignored studies in which Black students outperformed white students. That's just one example. He also used convenience sampling rather than representative sampling. So when he's making generalizations about the IQ scores for various countries, he's in one example, he was basing the national IQ scores for a country on a small population found in a refugee camp. Or in another case, he was basing it on a sample of children who had immigrated to a different country, rather than kind of thinking more holistically about where that. I mean, this is like a completely aside from I think the research has demonstrated that IQ as a concept is a problematic one just in general. But beyond that, he was also not practicing good data collection activities. It is just generally kind of unscientific and motivated by racist ideas. I think it's fairly clear when you look at the research that has come out after his research and has debunked what he discovered. So it is concerning that it's coming up in these kind of AI summary results, that a lot of this was being traced back to kind of what to this single source, right? So here's just a little overview of the case study that I use, or what I did with the students. So we had 8 undergraduate peer research advisors. So they're kind of in charge of doing like evening reference in our library. And they also do some outreach to fellow undergraduate students and kind of help with the basic level reference questions. but I wanted to kind of give them some choice in kind of what topics we focused on for training. And one of the things that they were really, really interested in was learning about AI tools. So I used this was the fourth in a 4-session training sequence about generative AI. So they already had kind of a foundation in kind of what different tools exist, what are some kind of prompting strategies. We had already gotten into a little bit of a conversation about like when and where you might want to use an AI tool and where you might want to avoid it. So they had some kind of like a baseline familiarity with how AI tools worked, like ChatGPT or Perplexity were the ones that they were using most frequently. So basically, I prompted the students to ask whatever AI tool they chose. And again, most of them chose ChatGPT because they were familiar with it. I think maybe one of them chose Perplexity because that was one I had suggested. But basically, to prompt it to ask for a list of countries with the highest and lowest IQs. And then I also asked them to just like choose a couple of countries that they were interested in and to just ask it what the IQ scores for that particular country were. And then we used lateral reading skills to kind of figure out where those numbers came from. And I also had the benefit of the previous semester, we had done a whole training sequence around Mike Caulfield's SIFT method. So the students were already kind of familiar with what lateral reading was. So the basic idea is lateral reading is that you're going outside and kind of reading a wide variety of sources and not just looking at the source itself to kind of figure out what where the information is coming from and get a greater context around that. So we were using some of those same skills. So I was not sure because these things change all the time. So these are screenshots from December 20th when I knew that I was going to be doing this presentation because I wanted to make sure that I was capturing kind of what the state of these tools looked like at that point. So these things may have changed since then because these tools change all the time. But this is just a screenshot of Perplexity from December 20th, 2024. And the prompt that I gave it was, what countries have the highest and lowest IQs? So basically it gives me a nice little table, a nice little list. It gives 5 with the highest and 5 with the lowest. I did the same thing with, and then here's comparing what is the average IQ in Guatemala. I took one of the ones that it said had the lowest IQ average, and I looked in ChatGPT. ChatGPT gave me a range for Guatemala of 80 to 85. And then Perplexity gave me a very precise number, 47.72. So that right in and of itself is interesting because they're very different, obviously. So that was interesting to kind of think about. But yeah, but basically it gives you a nice, excuse me, it gives you a nice number, right? And if you just stop there, then you wouldn't necessarily know where that number came from. I wanted to just demonstrate a little bit of lateral reading that we did with the Perplexity results. So Perplexity is nice in that it gives you kind of sources that it's pulling its answer from. ChatGPT is a little harder, and we'll go into that a little bit more later to figure out exactly where the information is being pulled from. But this is very very clear kind of where it's coming from. But so I had the students choose the sources and try to figure out, where is this information ultimately coming from? Kind of with the idea that most information that you're going to find on the internet is not original to that source. So like tracking it enough that you can actually figure out where the original source of the information is from. So in my example, average IQ in Guatemala, for the first source that it cites is this business day. And then you can kind of see this is where I tracked it, right? So it went from business day to this site called datapandas.org. And then scrolling through there, then it goes to this publication from Richard Lynn called The Intelligence of Nations. So even though it's posted in whatever this news site Business Day is, it ultimately does track back again to those problematic Richard Lynn statistics. So this was really eye-opening for the students because they're kind of used to when they're doing lateral reading, kind of thinking of like one source deep, but really showing how this was tracking ultimately back to the same set of poorly conceived statistics was really eye-opening for them. Okay, so this is what the students ended up finding. Um, Most of the sources we were seeing either linked back to those Richard Lynn statistics, or they were from linking back to companies that were selling IQ tests. There's a couple of instances where the kind of main source we were seeing was a company that was selling IQ tests that claimed to be more culturally neutral than a typical IQ test. But ultimately they're selling a product. So right, it's either these kind of debunked statistics, or it's a company that's trying to sell a product. So draw what conclusions you want from that, I guess. It was really interesting, and I wish I couldn't find this again, but one of my students found one of the sources was what looked like a completely AI generated website. It had kind of the structure of a website, but when you clicked on any of the links, it was all just empty pages. So that was really interesting. There's kind of this like empty infrastructure, right? That was there. We did find it was easier to track sources when using Perplexity versus something like ChatGPT. But in general, the sources on Perplexity were not particularly rigorous. I think the example I showed was kind of a questionable news site. We saw things that were linking to like Reddit forums, which can be useful for some kinds of information, but for something like this, I had some questions about it. Let's just say, they're linking to like Quora questions, or they're linking to someone's blog, right? So they're not necessarily what I would consider particularly rigorous sources. There were sometimes some kind of like caveats or framing language in terms of the tool kind of prompting you to kind of complicate your question a little bit, like, is IQ really a good measure of intelligence? But those were typically at the bottom of the answer. So you would get this nice little table saying like, here's all the IQs for various countries. And then, maybe if you read through the whole summary, it would say, oh, and by the way, this is maybe not a very good proxy for understanding the intelligence of a particular population. But you're not going to get that unless you are conscientiously reading the whole thing. So I did a little bit of experimentation after this to kind of think about, like, this is obviously one example of where the AI is giving kind of spitting out information that could be traced to a really problematic source. But I was trying to think about like what other, like how else could someone who's like using this for maybe some kind of problematic reasons interact with the tool. So I did some kind of more like, I'll say I did some searches using kind of more like dehumanizing language to kind of see how it would react. Because I'm sorry, IQ is kind of this, I think there's ways in which it can be used in a very dehumanizing way, but it kind of on the face seems very neutral. So I was experimenting a little bit with like, if I actually go in and use kind of dehumanizing language to talk about people, how is it going to react to that? So apologies for this. So the first one I did, this was like a really, obviously a hot button issue, but trying to see what it would say if I said how many deaths have illegals caused in the United States. This is not how I would normally search for this, obviously, but thinking about, someone who's interested in using this as a way to win a particular political point. I thought this was interesting because it did rephrase my question in its answer. So it was saying caused by undocumented immigrants, and it did provide some reframing language, but it does actually still provide you a number without a lot of context. It does kind of give you a little bit of context, but I was talking about this with someone recently, and they're like, well, it doesn't really, just giving a number without kind of like, how does this compare to the population as a whole is not that useful. So okay, but not great, right? It does still provide you a number that if you were asking this question you could use for potentially harmful reasons. This was another one that it refused to answer because it was too offensive. But it's basically the same question that you're asking when you're asking what the IQ is for people in Guatemala, right? It's just phrased in a way that's really insensitive. And it was interesting that this, I cannot provide an answer to this query as it's based on an inappropriate and offensive premise. So I thought that was interesting that it's like, it can kind of differentiate, right? When it's very clearly an offensive premise, but with something that seems kind of neutral like IQ, it's not providing that same level of kind of hedging, I guess. I was also curious about kind of like how it would handle like a dubious health claim. I had just been listening to a podcast about green coffee bean extract, so that's why I chose this example. One of the things I noticed, I mean, and this is true of Google too, that the way you frame the question will frame the results you get, right? So if I search for what are the health benefits of green coffee bean extract versus if I search for something like how has green coffee bean extract been debunked, right? It's going to get me very different results. But again, I noticed that it did provide some kind of caveats, like this research there's not a lot of research, it's very preliminary. But those caveats are kind of after you get this kind of list of like several potential health benefits. So you get this whole list and then it's little caveats at the end. And again, a lot of the sources that I was seeing in Perplexity were not what I would consider particularly rigorous. So not necessarily like research articles, mostly like health and wellness, kind of consumer health and wellness sites. So worth kind of thinking about. Okay, so in general, kind of key lessons, I think from this. So I think it's really important to practice lateral reading on AI results. It's important to teach our students to do this if we're working with them in a class or at the reference desk, or if we're training student employees to help their fellow students with AI. I think this was a really good case study for demonstrating the importance of that. It was kind of shocking for them. It kind of shocked them out of their kind of because it's a high stakes kind of thing. So that was helpful. I did notice kind of in my preliminary kind of poking around that some hot button issues do appear to return more framing language. But again, if it's something like IQ, which is being used in a political way, but doesn't on its face seem particularly political, it's not going to have the same kind of context around it. And I think this process kind of demonstrates that it's easy for debunked ideas that were widely published and talked about to resurface in AI results without a whole lot of context. So I think that's something that we as librarians and information professionals really need to think about as we're assisting students and kind of learning how to use various AI tools. So that's what I have. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. I'm going to take a second to kind of see what's been in the chat so I can answer questions that way. So
thank you very much, Emilia, for this wonderful presentation and a wonderful case study that you shared with us. Marge said that just like BMI, it's badly developed on a small group that has been widely adopted for centuries. So this is
I think BMI is
everybody agreed.
Probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Colin said, I tested that the response got is the same.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, I had, yeah, cool.
Yeah. And Paul is asking a great question. Are you questioning the free model or the subscription models, specifically the pro or deep research models? It makes a big difference in the response.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I was questioning the free models, and I had a reason for that, which is that I think most of my students are not paying for the deep search or the more the subscription models. Like your typical undergraduate student, I don't think is paying for that. So I wanted to kind of replicate like what are they going to be experiencing and like what are their peers experiencing in terms of the information that they're getting from AI.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, thank you. Reese says, I'm interested to hear about other institutions who provide subscription Gen AI tools. We will roll out Gemini to students in September, currently rolling it out to staff and faculty.
okay.
So,
Yeah, I know my institution has through our Microsoft subscription, we have Copilot. I found Copilot to be kind of frustrating for trying to do any kind of like searching.
mhm,
Um, so, but yeah, I'd be interested to hear from other people who are using those different ones at kind of an institutional level. I know some places provide their students with like a Chat GPT
mhm.
subscription or like a local instance as well.
Yeah, wonderful. And Isabel says, I personally have a lot of concerns about encouraging tools like this from a information literacy perspective, but I'll be interested to hear how situations like this pan out.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
likewise. Yeah.
yeah,
I
likewise.
have a lot of concerns too, honestly. Like I think my stance has always been like the students are using it, so we need to like I feel like I need to understand it because that's what the students are doing. And there's like a lot of benefit in understanding it.
Mhm,
But from like an ethical perspective, I'm like maybe it's probably clear from this presentation, I'm not like a super huge fan, especially of using AI instead of a search engine or instead of doing research in like a library database. I think there's a really high chance that you're going to get information that is not like from a questionable source or not complete or lacking context that would actually be helpful. So
mhm. Yeah, correct. Jefferson also is pointing out to the caveats that you mentioned about the framing language. And this is also uh, an ethical issue beyond the AI, since we don't want to have clickbait references.
mhm.
So,
Yeah,
and added, I do wonder why, sorry, how it actually flags something as offensive. I feel like I get the general idea of how they would train a model to do that, but how does it know the difference between calling someone or a group stupid and referencing with stupid in the titles such as Ernest Scared Stupid? So the
yeah, that's a good
context,
question.
yeah, the context is really important. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, and I know, and I think that's one of the things that like we as like information professionals should like do a lot of experimentation with things like this so we can kind of understand. And I think it changes too. That's like kind of a moving target, right? So that's the other thing that that I find kind of frustrating about this is it's kind of opaque and it is a moving target in terms of kind of what the AI is going to do on a given day.
Yeah. Yeah. And Bill has a question. Have you tested with any vendor supplied AI discovery tools, research assistants, such as Ex Libris, someone research assistants?
I
I think that's
haven't
a great question. Yeah.
yeah, I haven't. I don't. My institution uses EBSCO We don't have Summon anymore, but I don't know if there's instances of Summon, the Summon Research Assistant that are like publicly available, or if that's always going to be behind a patron login. But I
Mhm.
mean, if someone knows of a library that has that I can play around with it, I'd definitely be interested in hearing about it.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Josephine says, I have only done this as self-exploration, but haven't taught it to faculty or students yet. And adds also is if asking a research question, I begin the prompt saying my role, like librarian, researchers, university students, and then asking for research articles from peer-reviewed journals. Then I explore answers from different tools and compare those results, those answers. And Javier also uses the same the similar methodology. And as Elizabeth defines also tone, defining tone makes the tone, yeah, defining the tone makes a huge difference. Correct.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I found that too. So like the strategy I've used, I think that gets more effective results is um sometimes asking like, is there any research, or like, can you identify research on a particular topic? And that could sometimes lead to like, okay, there's a researcher working on this topic, and then you can kind of track down their research. But I think one of the things that, and this is what I tell my students too, is it's only looking at things that it can like crawl on the open web. So you're still going to miss out. Like, you need to use it in concert with other kind of things behind paywalls, because um, you're not necessarily going to find the whole kind of comprehensive breadth of research, but it can definitely be a good starting point if you use it more like, help me identify the research rather than like asking it to answer a question, if that kind of makes sense as a different framing.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And Janet has a question. Were the students surprised at how easily bad science comes up in these tools, or they are already skeptical of them? And Melissa wonders also the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's a range. I mean, I had one student who was very clear that they were very opposed ethically to AI just in general. So they were starting from a very different point from one of my other students, who was kind of very much like, oh, I use this to kind of like help me brainstorm for essays, right? So I think that like she was much more kind of like surprised by how clear this kind of connection was to the bad science than my other student, who was already pretty skeptical about AI from like kind of an ethical perspective. So yeah, I think I mean, it's just
Yeah.
like librarians, right? Like, there's going to be a kind of a range of different like approaches to these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And Jefferson says, I do wonder how it actually flags. Oh, I just yeah,
I think
no.
someone might have responded to it again.
Mariam
Yeah.
is answering that. I work on AI model trainings, and we have general rules and guidelines on classifications of what is considered harmful, generalization, and different level of harmfulness, and what the AI should respond to with. I know we are currently working on mitigating the falsification of information or lying based on presented incentives. And
Yeah.
that's very,
Awesome.
yeah, very
That's really
accurate.
interesting. Yeah. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, I know that
And
people need to get to the next session. So
yes, and that's all. Yeah. Thank you so much, Emilia, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions. And
thank you.
the conference is continuing. Thank you all. Bye-bye.